Well, good morning. Thank you. If you've got your notebook, your journal that we've been going through this devotional 40 days of seeing God, we're on day 34 and 35, seeing God in the city. And as we were singing that song, there's a couple lines in there that say, you're the light in the darkness. You're the hope to the hopeless. You're the peace to the restless. You are. And as I've sang those songs over the year, or those lyrics over the years, it's struck me that there are so many moments in my life where it says, you're the light in the darkness, you're the hope in the hopeless, you're the peace to the restless, you are. I have no problem with that phrase. I have no problem with those lines. I've always bought into that. I believe that God is all of those things. But what I've missed along the way is realizing that I'm part of that statement. I'm a part of that journey. You see, when it says you're the light in the darkness, you're the hope in the hopeless, one of the things that you're looking at, if you're going to buy into this idea of seeing God in the city, you also have to understand that those areas of bringing light to the darkness, hope to the hopeless, peace to the restless, then that burden becomes on our shoulders as well. And what I've missed along the way many times in my life when I felt like God was nudging me or leading me to go and talk to somebody or go and sit with somebody or stop on the side of the road when somebody's car is broken or go to somebody who I can tell is broken, and I say the simple statement of just, you know what, somebody else will go and stop with them. Somebody will go and be with them. Somebody will go into that darkness instead of me. I'm too busy, or I got too much stuff going on. And I miss the moments. I miss the opportunities where God places these things in before my life. And I realize, you know what? God is going to go into those places, but I'm also called. So when you see God in the city, you also have to understand that you see his people rising up and bringing these places of pain and despair, bringing hope and bringing joy and bringing love. The key idea that we're looking at this morning is simply this. How do you respond when God calls you to rise up and run toward places of brokenness? How do you respond when God calls you to rise up and run toward places of brokenness? As Palmer and I were talking about looking at seeing God in the city, one of the things, my story is this phrase, live, love, and this journey that I've been on for about the last 15 years of figuring out what it means. And we have a nonprofit, my wife and I have a 501c3 non-religious nonprofit called Live Love. And we set it up intentionally as a non-religious so that we could partner with local governments, with the city, with the school systems. And through that process of kind of just really figuring out what it means to live love, Paul and I were talking about, look, if we're going to be looking at seeing God in the city, then let's take a step back and let's retell the story of Live Love and how it came to be. So if you've been here for a while, there'll be some of the stories that I've shared that you may have heard, some of the phrases, some of the verses. But I also want you to know that if you are here, which you are obviously, there's some stories that I'm going to tell that are graphic. And I apologize, but you have to see the depth of the violence that I lived through and some horror and pain that I struggled through in order to figure out how does God really call me to live. And so there will be stories that are disturbing, to be honest with you. When Live Love started, it was just a phrase. And then it grew into something else. And 9 years ago, my wife and I started the nonprofit. And one of the things she did first was she went to the city and she simply said, where are the broken places in this city that I can go and love? Where is it that you can tell me, hey, this is a hurting community? A year ago, she shared her story as she went door to door and began just talking to people and just saying, I'm here, is there anything you need? And having the door shut on her multiple times. And eventually getting to the place where she's sitting down and having tamales on a regular basis. And she's sitting in this community and getting to know them and experiencing life with them. And through that process, I remember she would ask me, hey, I'm going to go down into the neighborhood. Do you want to come with me? I'm like, no, I don't want to go. She's like, why? I'm just going to go and talk to people. Right, that's why I don't want to go. I don't want to go and talk to people. If they have something broken, come talk to me and I'll go fix it, but I don't want to go on that part. She goes, but Paul, that's where you really get to know the community. I know, I get it. Have fun with that. I don't want to go. And as we're looking this morning, we're going to be looking at the life of Jonah and how he ran from God. I realize that there's some parallels of how he lived and how I was living. When God was calling him to go, he chose to run. And when God was calling me to walk with my wife, I was like, I don't know if I can go with you. You know, when you look at the key idea, how do you respond when God calls you? The very first thing you have to recognize is that God is calling you. But I struggled for years with recognizing his voice and being able to listen to his voice and knowing that it's him speaking. Like I said, I've been a Christian my whole life. Grew up in the church. I'm a third-generation pastor. Had no desire to be a pastor. But God led me into this place. And when I first transitioned from working in business and the music industry to being a pastor, I remember there were moments when I would sit and I would just ask God to speak to me to make sure I know that I'm doing the right thing. And I would hear silence. I would hear nothing. And I remember we were in a prayer meeting with some friends of ours, and it was this time of discernment. They were thinking of adopting some kids and really were looking at this crossroads in their life. And so myself, my wife, this couple, a group of pastors from our church and church leaders, we all gathered and we began to pray for this couple. And in this meeting, the prayer just continued, and every now and then a pastor would stand up and they would say, hey, I feel like God is just really leading me to share this verse with you. And they would share the verse, and I would listen, I'd be like mind blown. It's like, how do they do that? Like, how can they be so in tune to God's voice? And I remember as I'm sitting there, I'm just kind of praying, and I really honestly felt like God spoke to me. I felt like he said, I want you to share this verse with them. And I remember sitting there going, wow, I've never really experienced anything like this. Okay, I'll share the verse with them. And so I went to stand up, and I'm like, well, but I don't know what that verse is, so I need to look it up first. And I felt like God was saying, do you not trust me? I'm like, yeah, I trust you. It's cool, but I kind of like to know what I'm saying before I stand up. I don't want to just stay up and say a verse. I want to know what that verse says. Stand up. Just rise up out of your seat. No, I'm not going to do it. And then I got to a point where I started to stand up. My wife looked at me. I'm like, never mind. And she's like, what are you doing? I'm like, hey, can I borrow your Bible? Because being the good Christian that I was, I didn't bring my Bible. And so I borrowed her Bible, and I start looking through it. I'm sitting there, and I'm just going all through it back and forth and looking all over the place. And I'm starting to get frustrated because I can't find the verse that God is telling me to share, and I need to know what these words are before I share these words. And finally, she leans over to me. She's like, what are you doing? I'm like, I feel like God is telling me to share this verse, but I can't find the verse. She's like, well, what verse are you looking for? And I said, well, I feel like God is telling me to share Hezekiah 4:11 with them. And by the fact that none of you are laughing realizes that you don't know that Hezekiah is not a book in the Bible either. And she leans over, she goes, there is no book of Hezekiah. I'm like, what? She goes, there's no book of Hezekiah. There's a king Hezekiah, but there's no book of Hezekiah. I'm like, yeah, but it was Hezekiah 4:11, like specifically that God was speaking to me. She goes, that's not God. You've got the wrong connection. And I just kind of looked at her and I'm like, seriously? And I hand her to the Bible back. And I'm like, I'm done. You guys keep praying because I obviously have no idea what's going on. And as I'm walking out, it was kind of funny, but it was also like, I felt like a failure. My wife was like, why were you looking for the book of Hezekiah? I'm like, honestly, I thought Jesus was speaking into my soul and telling me to share this verse. She goes, you almost stood up and told them, hey, Hezekiah 4:11 is for you. Like 15 years later, now I really wish I would have, because that would have made this story so much more epic. Idiot. In reality, I wasn't in tune with God's voice. Like I wasn't recognizing, I wasn't spending the time that I needed to be in that moment to be ready. Now, as you look at Jonah and you look at who he is, it starts in Jonah chapter 1 and it just starts speaking. The very first thing it says is the word of the Lord came to Jonah because Jonah was a prophet and he recognized God's voice. And it says, God said, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for the port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. You see, first off, Jonah recognized this is God's voice, and God is specifically calling me to go to this city. And then as he processed through it, Jonah had to make the decision, you know what? I don't want to go. And so he went in the complete opposite direction. You see, as they've studied this passage, one of the things that they believe is that Jonah wasn't the only prophet. He wasn't the only person that could speak for God. So when God spoke to him and said, I need you to go and do this, Jonah thought about it and said, you know what? No, I don't want to. Send somebody else. You can use anybody else you want, but I don't want to be a part of this. Which brings us back to these moments when we realize that God is speaking or calling to us, and we have that choice to go, am I going to do this or not? You know what? I'm going to run. I'm going to run in the opposite direction. Jonah's story then, as you know, he gets on the boat, a storm erupts, chaos ensues, and Jonah comes up and says, look, guys, this is my fault. Throw me off the boat, storm will go away. The crew, being the good crew they are, say, no problem. Huck him off the ship. As soon as he hits the water, the storm stops, and it says that a great fish swallowed him, and he was inside the fish for 3 days. Now, I scientifically can't explain that, nor do I theologically fully understand it. When I die and go to heaven, this is one of the stories when I say, really, he was in a fish? Like this really happened? But if you think about it, one of the things that they say it was 3 days in living death, and then he was delivered by God to go and preach in Nineveh. As Jonah's in the fish, the only thing he can do is think about the things that he didn't do. And so as he's sitting there, I don't know if you've ever been swallowed by a fish, but there's not a good ending. So I don't think he was imagining at some point he's going to be spit back up and God would then use him to go and change the city. All he's thinking about is, I didn't listen, I didn't follow, and now I'm going to die. You know, those seasons of living death can be these moments in our lives that just ruin you, that just wreck your soul. For me, Live Love came out of a period of complete brokenness. And I remember the first thing that happened to me, I was living in Guatemala. I was standing in front of my church, and I hear gunshots, and I turn around, and there's a guy probably 30 feet away from me shooting another man in the chest. Shoots him 5 times in the chest, and then turns the gun on me and begins to run towards me. I hold the Olympic world record in the 100-meter dash. 8.4 seconds. All you got to do is have a gun on you and have them chasing you. And I remember getting away and then coming back to the scene and standing over this man. He's still alive, and he's got his shirt open, and he's got 5 bullet holes in his chest. And as I stood here over him, I remember realizing, I watched his life pass, and I remember realizing, like, that's it. Like, that was the ending of that man's story. And the fragileness of life, as I stood here, just destroyed me. Now, growing up overseas, I've seen lots of acts of violence, sadly. But that was the first time I stood over somebody as they died. I remember walking away and just for a couple days, just really like processing through the fact that like his story is over. Like that is it. Like for the rest of time, whatever he did before that moment is all people are going to talk about. Like what if he missed those moments? What if he didn't realize, this idea of what it means to fully pursue Christ? Like that rocked me. A couple of weeks later, I was driving to church in a taxi. I'm in the back seat. My taxi cut off another guy. That car begins to chase us. We come up to a stoplight. The car pulls up within inches away from us. Window goes down, and this gun comes out. Sticks right at my head. And I remember just hitting the ground and hiding underneath the seat and just absolutely, again, just ruined. Just done. And just realizing what in the world is going on. Like, how did this world become this way? And so that kind of messed with my mind a little bit, as it does. A couple weeks later, sending our kids to school, they took a carpool and they drive up through the city, and as they were coming up the hill to go to their school, a gunfight erupted. And on both sides of the street, 2 rival gangs with machine guns just lit each other up. My kids made it through 5 to 10 seconds before the gunshots began. And I remember thinking that night when we found out, I'm like, if we would have been 10 seconds late in letting our kids out the door, again, the fragileness of life, and then I began to struggle through the darkness, the evil, the struggles that are all around us. And I began processing through, what in the world? Like, God, how do you even allow this kind of stuff to happen? So I began running as therapy. I went straight Forrest Gump, and I just started running. Every day after work, I got out and I just started running. I got hit by a car once when I was running, and I jumped up on the car. I saw it coming. It was a slow hit, so it wasn't that big of a deal. And out of my anger, I slammed my fist into the hood, and the guy took a gun and stuck it on my head. I'm like, it's like I can't escape this. What in the world? And so I ran in a half marathon. I was driving up to Coban, which is up in northern Guatemala, and as I'm driving up there with my son, this car passes me going probably 80 miles an hour. We're entering into a blind curve. And as they passed me, it was like this moment when we looked at each other. And in my mind, I'm thinking, what's wrong with you? Like, why are you passing me on a blind curve? You could kill somebody. As they looked back at me, they're all laughing and pointing and going like this. 10 seconds later, they come around that curve, head on into a truck. Just chaos. Out of the truck, this little husband and wife and this little 8-year-old girl get out. The husband and wife are okay, but the girl's entire lip was just hanging off her face. And I just was furious because this could have been prevented. So I sat her down and I was helping them out. And then I walked over to the car. And as I walked over to the car, all 4 doors are missing. And I'm standing there next to them. I'm watching them, and they're just filled with puncture marks. And I watched them bleed out. And all 4 of them died just like that. And instead of going from the fragileness of life, I was in a place where I'm like, you know what? This is your fault. You caused this. You deserve this. Got back in my car a while later and left. And as I'm driving away, a bus comes around a blind curve in my lane, and this time drives me off the road. And I almost drove through a house. Sitting there, and I'm just done. I'm just like, God, what in the world? How can, like, literally in a year's time, one person see that much death? And then I began processing through, like, what are you supposed to even do with that? It brought me to this place where I thought, you know what? There's so much evil and darkness and brokenness and hate and just vile stuff in this world. How can one person even make a difference? Like, honestly. Like, I was down on my knees. I remember just processing through, God, what in the world? Like, how? I don't even know how to process this, let alone move forward and try to change the world. I'm done. You know, that key idea that we're looking at this morning is this of how do you respond when God calls you to rise up and run toward these places of brokenness? In that moment, I think about Jonah, when God called him to go to this great, wicked city. He called him to go to Nineveh, and Jonah ran, and he went in the opposite direction. And honestly, if God would have called me in that moment to go and serve in these places of brokenness, I think I would have gone in the opposite direction as well, because I was finished. You know, the beautiful thing about God is how he pursues us and continues to come after us. Jonah is spit up on the beach. And then it says in chapter 3, then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you. You see, even though Jonah ran as far as he could and went in the complete opposite direction and going exactly where God didn't want him to go, God still came to him and said, I still have the same calling, and I still want you to go and say the same thing. It's this beautiful picture of grace in our lives. And regardless of how far we've walked, how far we've gone away, how far we've just absolutely left his presence, how deep in sin we're stuck, he still says, hey, I'm still here. I'm still waiting for you. I can still use you. If you're going to go into the city, you have to rise up. And you have to run toward those places of brokenness. Now it says Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. And Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming 40 more days, and Nineveh will be overthrown. See, they call Jonah the greatest evangelist of all times because he went into the city. I believe he was just walking instead of running. He went to the middle of the city, and he says one sentence. And through that one sentence, the entire city comes to God. It says the Ninevites believed God. Just like that, they completely turned. The entire city turns and believes God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on a sackcloth. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose. from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. You see, when he said this 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown actually has two meanings. And they would have understood it with two completely opposite things just by saying that one word. You see, overthrown, first of all, would have meant undone. You're finished. So in 40 more days, Nineveh will be finished. It'll be destroyed. Or the second interpretation of that same word is 40 more days and Nineveh will be turned over. It will reform itself. As I was reading through that, thinking to myself of what if somebody came to me and said, look, you have 40 days. You have 40 days and it's over. Would it change how I was living? Would I do my devotions more? Would I pursue God with more fervor? Would I go into his arms on a more regular basis? The Ninevites believed God, and then it says that they rose. You see, when the king rose up, that's like saying he was forfeiting his throne and his robe to the justice of God. An entire community turns and comes into relationship with God. The key is, it's not just a one-day thing. It wasn't just a one-day moment where they're like, you know what, today we're coming into relationship with God. If you look at Isaiah, it talks about a similar thing of sitting through fasting and sitting through pain. It says in Isaiah 58, it says, you cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen, only a day for people to humble themselves? Oftentimes our faith is tied up in Sunday. And not just Sunday, but Sunday morning. And not just Sunday morning, but 9 o'clock or 10:45. And not even from 10:45 to whatever time we end at. What time do we end at? 10:45, 11:45, whatever it is. But it's like 3 minutes before, you know what, I got to go. I'm running. I'm out of here. That was enough. I got to leave. And we get to these places where we're like, you know what, I'm just going to give God a portion or a bit or a small allowance of who I am. And if you look at Scripture, and one of the things for me with Live Love was realizing that God calls us unconditionally to go into these places of brokenness, to go into these places where they're hurting. And I realized that Live Love for me was taking me from a place of pain into a place of understanding that in Scripture we are called to go and love on the broken. It says in verse 6, it says, is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood. Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here I am. You see, this idea of continually coming towards God and continually pursuing him and continually looking for these opportunities to live out the gospel. How will you respond when God calls you to rise up and to run toward these places of brokenness? You see, for me, that season of death, that season of living death, took me to a place that I really didn't expect. And as I tied that in with this passage in Isaiah and this calling to go into the broken places of the world, I found myself regularly down on my knees asking God, like, how do I do this? And so I began seeking out his voice, because that Hezekiah 4:11 moment, honestly, stuck with me. And I didn't want to be back in another place where I was misinterpreting or I wasn't really hearing. I wanted to be able to move forward knowing that this is the voice of God speaking truth into my life. I remember one of the verses that I read, and it just stuck with me, was this passage, John 10:10. And it simply says, I have come that you may have life and that you may have it to the full. You know, that moment for this man passed, and his season was over. His life was done. And looking at who I was and where I was in my pursuit of Christ, I realized that I just really have one choice, and that is to live. And I can live on my own version of it, or I can follow him. And so this idea of living, I realized when Jesus said, I have come that you may have life, but to have it to the full. Not just a haphazard life, not just part of a life, but a full life. A life where I'm embracing moments, a life where God is using me, a life where I don't really understand what's happening, but I'm recognizing his voice. So I held on to that truth. God wants me to have this type of life that is full. He wants me to live with this complete passion that God fills me. And then I came across this verse in 1 John 3:18. It says, dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. If you see in Scripture, it says the greatest commandment is to love. And you'll see throughout love is this theme is over and over and over again. But as I stood beside these guys, I had no love. Like I was done. And yet I felt like God was bringing me to this place in brokenness where he says, I know that this place of brokenness is exactly where you don't want to be, but that's where I can use you best. And so this idea of live love, for me, honestly, was just a phrase that kept bringing me back to the gospel that said, you need to live with this type of love where God is living through you. And his life is shining through you, and his truth is evident to those around you, and that you begin to learn to recognize my voice. And so as I was processing through that and looking at how God is deeper in our lives, and how he has the ability to change and to bring us forward, we began praying about Live Love in Chandler, and we began seeing how it was serving and going deeper, and more stuff was happening, and we decided to start a Live Love Day. And so once a year, we gathered as many people as we could, and we went and served downtown, and we brought God's love to the broken. We went and helped them paint their houses, redo their landscaping, and we were just there with them. And then each year, we saw that go from 250 people to 500 people to 750 people. One year, we had 1,200 people. And I remember at the end of that day, watching everybody leave, and I asked my wife the question, like, what good did this really do? Like, it's a good thing, but it was just a one-day thing. And we would have people come and talk to us and say, hey, when's the next Live Love Day? We really want to serve. My response was always, hey, we do this like every single week. Like, I can send you down there anytime you want. Yeah, I really like the big events. It's funner. Which I don't know if that's a word, but it's funner. And we process through, like, what are we called to do? Like, where are we called to go with this idea of live love? Live love for us meant a life-changing way to live. It meant going into a community that is filled with brokenness and always being there. So we started praying about how do we move forward. We decided to cancel our Live Love Days. And we had some people that were angry about that, but we really felt God was speaking to us saying, I need you there on a regular basis. So we started praying about a house that we could purchase. Any house, a house that was filled with brokenness that we could go and restore beauty to. And so eventually we were led to a house and we made an offer on the house. It was a former heroin house. It was the center of the community for drugs. And I thought, that's the perfect house. I want the worst. So we made an offer of $55,648.19 on December 7th, 2012. That's the exact amount. And they said, okay, we'll accept your offer of $648.19, but you got to close in 2 weeks. I said, no problem. God's leading us to do this. I heard his voice clearly, not a problem. And so I started for a 2-week phase of raising money, and I told my wife, I said, I'm going to sell Live Love stickers and hats and T-shirts, and we'll just sell that and we'll raise the money because that's what God's called us to do. I sold one shirt for $1,000. It's a good profit margin. But after 13 days, I had raised $15,636.85. And I was realizing, like, that's really good because we didn't really have any money, but I'm still $40,000 short. And the bank called me and said, now you're coming down tomorrow to close, right? And I said, yes. Like, when do you need the money? She's like, well, when you come in tomorrow. But you need a cashier's check, so you need to get that cashier's check today so you can bring it to us tomorrow. I remember sitting in my office and my stomach just shrunk and I just panicked. And I thought, oh my word, this is Hezekiah 4:11 all over again. I missed the memo, I wasn't hearing clearly, and I'm starting to panic. My buddy walked into my office probably an hour later and he says, hey, if I write you a check for $30,000, will that get you to where you need to be? I'm like, you're just going to write me a check for 30 grand? He goes, yeah. And I'm like, well, I actually need 40,000. I mean, 30,000, 40,000, what's the difference? So he said, okay. And he got out his checkbook and he wrote a check to Live Love, $40,000. And I said, I don't know how I'm going to pay you back. He said, I will figure it out later. Don't worry about it. And I sat there. Now, a side note of that story, 3 months later, he came and told me, he goes, hey, I got a check today for $40,000. Apparently, I opened up an account 20 years ago that I forgot about, and they've been trying to track me down for 2 years. I don't know about you, but I don't have any accounts with 40,000 in that I don't know about. He goes, isn't that amazing how God provides? I'm like, yeah, write me another check. You know, as I was counting my money after God's money, I didn't really have much to do with it. We had raised $55,636.85. We were $11.34 short. My mind was blown because I'm like, I can come up with $11.34. I'll contribute that. And then I thought, you know what? No, I want the full blessing. God told me to do this. This was his prodding and his leading. I need $11.34 in the next hour because I got to go get this check. So I dug through my backpack, this is a true story. I pulled out 33 cents. On my wall, I had $1 that a junior high girl named Ashton had given to me years ago, and she wrote on there, change the world. And so I took that $1 down. That made me emotional. And I realized, you know what, I'm $10.01 short. So I walked into Palmer's office, and I said, hey, you know this journey we've been on? I said, I'm $10.01 short of being to the exact cent of what God called us to do. So he pulled open his drawer, dropped a penny on the desk. And I said, look, I'm going to tell this story the rest of my life. Do you want to be the penny guy? Or do you want to be the $10 and a penny guy? Because I'm cool with either one. That's on your shoulders, between you and Jesus. And he opened up his wallet like a true chin-chin, that's completely empty. I'm like, go to the coffee shop. That coffee shop was your idea. Go buy a coffee and ask for $10 more. And he just looked at me. I'm like, I'm not leaving. It's the only time in my life that I stood before him and said, hey, you got to go do this. And so he went, got a coffee, came back, and gave me $10. We raised $55,648.19. There was no, thank you. There was no Hezekiah 4:11 moment, but it was one of the scariest experiences of my life. What I've realized when you begin to recognize his voice, and when you begin to respond, and when you begin to rise up and run towards these places of brokenness, God calls you to continue to go deeper and farther and farther. 2 weeks ago, we just broke ground on 2 houses that we're building on Delaware Street, which is 1 block over. Oh, I need to back up. Here's a picture of the house. That was before and that was after. The beautiful thing, it was actually February 28th, 2015, not 2014. But everything in that house was provided. When we needed a roof, we prayed for a roof, and we just waited for somebody to come and say, hey, I got a roof. If you want all these shingles, I'll give them to you. I didn't want to do the part of it, raising the roof, and so another guy said, hey, I want to cancel work for my construction company today. Can we come and do that? Yeah. Insulation. We need insulation. God, we need insulation. Hey, how about a guy came up to me, he's like, is it all right if we insulate the house for you? Like literally moment after moment, I realized if God can provide $55,648.19, then he can provide every ounce of labor and material for that house. And so at the end of it, we owed 0 money, 100% free. And now it is the pillar of the community where this training and this love and this hope is brought to these places of brokenness. Pursuing God is scary. But when you enter into that river, into that current, it's like you want more and more and more of it. So we just broke ground on 2 houses that we're building. One is for a lady named Ruth and her husband Rolando. They've served as community leaders for us for the past 9 years. And what we've realized in community development, if there is no home ownership, there is no change in the community. She can't qualify for a loan. I can't figure out how to provide that loan for her, but I can figure out how to build her a house. Don't know how it's going to happen. Don't know where the money's going to come from, but I'm going to have faith that just like before, God will provide. It's not going to be in my timing. It's going to be in his timing, and at the end of it, she'll have a home. We also have a family from the Grove that's moving onto that same street to serve as her mentor. They'll be buying one of the houses and living with them. And so this journey of God continuing to pull us forward, we also then just were able to get 2 acres of land that's 1 block away, where we'll be putting in an urban garden, an urban farm, a training center, a commercial kitchen, so that people from the community can come and learn and grow and start businesses. And my wife and I are building a house, we'll be building a house on the back part of that property. How are we going to do those things? Don't have any idea. The beauty of it is God is leading us, and I've learned to recognize his voice and not stress about the details. It's still scary, and it's still like one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, but what I'm realizing, when you respond to when God is calling you, you have to rise up. You have to be able and willing to run toward these places of brokenness. And as soon as you start on that journey, the enemy is going to battle you and tell you you're failing and telling you you're weak and telling you you don't have what it takes. But through that process, recognizing God's voice has just been one of the greatest journeys I've ever been on in my life. And going from this season of darkness and pain and brokenness and bitterness and anger and struggle and just absolutely furious at God for allowing these things to happen, to now being in a place where I'm called to run towards these places of brokenness because I recognize them. I've lived through them. You see, I believe God uses each and every single one of us in our places of brokenness and says, now I want you to run toward those places of brokenness that you can relate to, that you can bring change to, that you can bring hope to, that you can bring love to. The question is, are you going to be like Jonah and like I was and walk in the opposite direction, or are you going to run towards those moments? You see, I fully believe with everything in me that God is simply saying to you, rise up. Rise up. All you have to do is stand up out of your seat and rise up. And be willing to run towards him. And even if it's at a slow walk or a crawl, to begin to rise up and slowly moving towards him and doing those areas in your life that you know he's calling you to. It'll be the scariest thing you've ever done. And there will be some Hezekiah 4:11 moments. I'm in the middle of one right now with some of the stuff my wife and I'm doing, and I'm processing through going, is this like a Hezekiah 4:11 moment, or is this God? And I just have to have faith that this is where God is leading me.